looking at the first 6 chapters, but primarily I wanted us to examine chapter 6, and that's what we did. We talked about the opening of the first 6 of the 7 seals that had been used to seal the scroll that John said was a vision of what was going to come to pass shortly. And we talked about these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, as they're called, which constitute the first 4 of these seals. And I believe that each of these represents a different period, chronologically in order, of the Roman Empire. That the white horse, which is the first one, represented a period of great victory and expansion for the empire. Then the second horse, which was fiery red, indicated a period of bloodshed, of warfare, and evidently internal warfare because of the term that is used. The third horse, which was black, represented a period to follow that, which would be a time of deprivation and hardship, a time of famine or rationing, and many people would suffer. And then the 8th verse talks about the pale horse, and the name of the rider was Death. Pale represents bloodlessness or death, and that there would be many who would die, but he says that this would constitute only a fourth of those who dwell upon the earth, indicating that although it would be devastating and be a horrible thing, that only a portion of the empire would be affected to such a drastic extent that it would not spell at that time the end of the empire. Then the opening of the 5th seal gives us a view of the souls under the altar, individuals who had been slain during this period of time that the first 4 seals talked about. In other words, during the time beginning with the writing of the book of Revelation to the end of the reign of Diocletian, the Roman Emperor Diocletian, that period of time many Christians died. Although during some of that time the church was allowed to proclaim the gospel and many people were won to Christ, yet there was a great persecution, and the worst of it came during the reign of Diocletian. Then those who died, now especially those who died for their faith during that period of time, they are represented by souls that John saw. Now obviously you can't see a soul, so John saw something that represented a soul, and that which he saw itself represented people who had lived upon the earth and had given their lives for the cause of Christ. And he says they were under the altar, and they were crying out for the Lord to make a just and righteous judgment upon those who had brought this evil upon them. And the Lord promised them that within a little time, a little while, however long that might have been, that vengeance would be brought, and the Lord would pass judgment righteously and in a holy and fair manner upon those who were the enemies of the cross of Christ. Then the 6th seal was opened, according to verse 12, and we have there in the remainder of chapter 6 a description of very turbulent events. And many people think, now listen carefully, many people think, and when I say many people, I mean included in that many preachers and teachers and everyday people believe that he is talking about the end of the world. And I say to you tonight that he is not, that these are symbolic terms. These are figurative terms. And I'll prove to you that such terms have been used before to describe the end of an empire. You'll notice he talks about a great earthquake, the sun becoming black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon become like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its late figs when it's shaken by a mighty wind, and the sky receded as a scroll when it's rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place, and the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Now, somebody says, well, that sure sounds like the end of the world. Well, if he's referring to the end of the world, if these are all literal things that he's describing, then how will we explain the next verse, the first verse of chapter 7? After these things, he saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth. At the end of the world comes to an end. Not any earth left, not any people left. Peter said that when the Lord comes again, when that time comes, he is going to cause the earth to be totally to disintegrate, and even the elements themselves shall melt with fervent heat. So if he's talking about the end of the world, then you've got the problem, a real problem of explaining all of chapter 7, and then the opening of the 7th seal in chapter 8, and for that matter, the remainder of the book of Revelation. If this means the end of the world, Arlen, you cannot understand the book of Revelation. It won't work. Doesn't mean the end of the world, though. Now, I handed these out last week, and if you'd like to have one later, there's some few left up here. I just want to give you a reference to what I wrote in here. The first 4 visions, that is, the first 4 seals, certainly center around war involving the Roman Empire. The first described a condition existing in the empire at the time John wrote, but the second vision would signal the beginning of disaster. The third and fourth visions picture the terrible results of the events which took place under the second seal. The church certainly suffered to a degree. I mean, the church existed in the Roman world. The Roman world went into turmoil and strife, and people were being killed. The church is affected by that because it existed during that time. But there was a growth that was allowed because there was a certain degree of religious liberty. But then came a terrible time, a time which led to the destruction of the empire itself, the beginning of the end. And I want to draw your attention to the 13th chapter of Isaiah, and let's read verses 10 through 13, and keep this in mind. That's Isaiah 13, starting with verse 10. Isaiah is writing about the fall of Babylon, talking about what it would be like in the world in figurative language when the empire of Babylon fell. You know, that's the empire that Daniel was in. That's the empire that Esther was in, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All these were involved in the Babylonian Empire, and Isaiah now is prophesying the end of that empire, and this is the way he describes it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will halt the arrogance of the proud, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I will make a mortal more rare than fine gold, a man more than the golden wedge of Ophir. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. He's not talking about the end of the world. He is talking about the destruction of Babylon. When John writes in the 6th chapter of Revelation of this same kind of thing happening, he's talking about the fall of the Roman Empire. And it would be best described as an earthquake. The very foundations of the world would shake, politically speaking, everyday life speaking. And mountain throughout the Bible has often been used to refer to a government. Have you not read, for instance, that in Daniel's vision he said that the mountain of the Lord's house will be set up? And he describes it as a kingdom which would be set up in the days of those kings. In other words, a mountain is a figurative term oftentimes used to refer to a government. It says the mountains would fall. People would call upon the mountains to protect them, the government to protect them, but it won't protect them because the government itself is disintegrating, is what he's saying. The stars fall from the heaven, the sun and moon being affected, indicating, now if you take the sun to be the emperor and the moon to be some underling authority, and all of the stars to be those local rulers that drew their power from the sun and the moon, these all not giving their light or falling from the sky would represent a tremendous political upheaval. And there would be many people who would seek to hide from that, but it would be unstoppable. The Lord assures us and assured them that the Roman Empire would be brought to a halt. Now let's go into chapter 7. Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that. What does verse 1 say? I'm sorry? Read it. Read it, please. Okay. Yeah. He says this is the burden, or this is the burden Babylon will carry. This is what's going to happen to Babylon. And then he describes it literally, and then he describes it figuratively. But he's talking about the same events. Now, let's look at chapter 7. You notice he starts out and he says, after these things. Has he opened the seventh seal yet? No, just the sixth seal has been opened. In chapter 8, the seventh seal will be opened. Therefore, chapter 7 could rightly be called an interlude. This is sort of a description of certain things that would take place in a period of history involving the Roman Empire that would be very advantageous to the church. And we know from history that there was such a period. That after Diocletian was overthrown and died, finally there came a man to the throne whose name was Constantine. Constantine started out being kind of hostile to the church. But Constantine was being opposed by 7 others who claimed to be emperor. And they were all putting their loyalty and all of their reliance on the pagan religious leaders. And Constantine thought, well, though that support is gone, and so he began to cultivate the Christians. And he began to urge them to grow and to be stronger and to give him some loyalty. And he offered them religious liberty. He issued an edict that no one could be punished for being a Christian. Followed that up with another edict that said that Sunday, which was the Christians' day of worship, would be recognized as an official day of rest every week for everybody in the Roman Empire, whether he was a Christian or not. Then he followed that up by calling a council, a convention worldwide of all the leaders of the Lord's church from all the areas, and in that convention he gave preferential treatment to Christian people and was even considered to be the earthly equivalent of the head of the church. In other words, Christ is the head of the church spiritually, and Constantine began to be recognized as the head of the church while he was emperor of Rome. During that time, the church, of course, made many converts. Many people were won to Christ. At the same time, the church began to drift away from the truth. Began to organize itself in a pattern after the Roman Empire. Began to take the situation as God had made it, where each congregation was autonomous and was overseen by a group of bishops, overseers, called elders, assisted by deacons, and began to say, well, one of these elders is the bishop. He's the head elder, you might say. And then these bishops would get together in a meeting and discuss things and began to pass rules and regulations, and they would elect one of their number to be the chief bishop or archbishop. And then all the bishops would get together and they would vote on one to be the cardinal archbishop. And then all the cardinals got together and they decided that the church needed one man on earth who would be over all. Whatever he would say, that would be as though God were speaking, and he would be, well, I don't know what they started out calling him, but I do know they ended up calling him Pope. And he was the equivalent of the Roman emperor. And that's how it was organized. The church wasn't organized that way when you read about it in the Bible. It came to be that way because of the influence that Constantine exerted over the church. Well, with all that in mind then, let's read on. I believe chapter 7, incidentally, is describing that rule of Constantine. He says, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth. Now, would angels be beings representing God and His power? Would that be a safe assumption? Okay, now, these angels are holding something back. And what they are holding back is described as the 4 winds of the earth. And listen to what these winds, or this wind, would do. If the wind were not held back, it should blow on the earth, on the sea, and on trees. But the angels are holding it back to prevent that. I believe that the wind then represents the evil force of the Roman Empire. In other words, the persecution that had been directed against the church and was increasing until Constantine came along. And so the Lord, through His providence, installed a situation to hold that persecution back for a long enough time so that the church could get a foothold, so that people could be converted, so that their hearts could be committed to the cause of Christ. And listen to how he describes that. He said, then I saw, now after the 4 angels are holding back, if you conclude that the angels are God's power holding back man's power under the influence of the devil, they're keeping the Roman Empire from destroying the church, which it certainly could have done had God not prevented it. And then he said, I saw another angel. This is a 5th angel, and this angel has a message. And he ascends from the east. Now, there's all sorts of interpretations as to what the east refers to here, but if you consider this possibility, John, when he receives this revelation, where is he? He's on the island of Patmos, which is in an arm of the Mediterranean Sea, right? To the east is Palestine. In Palestine is Bethlehem, where the Lord was born. In Palestine is Nazareth, where the Lord was raised. In Palestine is Jerusalem, where the gospel was preached for the very first time on the day of Pentecost. And the gospel had been proclaimed in Jerusalem, and many Jews heard the gospel, believed it, and obeyed it, but it was primarily Jerusalem. As the persecution against the church under Nero and others of the early emperors, as the persecution began, the church was scattered abroad, but they went everywhere preaching the gospel. But listen to some passages of Scripture, would you please? Oh, I don't know how I want to put all this together just right. I want you to listen, first of all, to Isaiah chapter 62, verses 1 and 2. Zion, what is Zion? It's Jerusalem. Mount Zion is there, and that's what it's called, Zion or Jerusalem. The Lord had chosen Jerusalem, hadn't He, as His city? That was the capital of His earthly kingdom, wasn't it? Israel, the nation of Israel. But look what had happened. Jerusalem had become a laughingstock because the nation had divided. Idolatry was practiced. The temple was overrun. The Romans had already demolished the temple by the time John wrote, as Jesus had said they would. So Jerusalem, which was the city of God, Zion, had become a laughingstock. And yet, listen, for Zion's sake, I will not hold my peace, said Isaiah. Isaiah said, I want to give up sometimes, but I can't do it. I will not hold my peace for Zion's sake. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not rest until her righteousness goes forth as brightness, and her salvation as a lamp that burns. The Gentiles shall see your righteousness, and all kings your glory. You shall be called by a new name, which the mouth of your Lord shall name. Now that's one passage. Remember that, okay? Go over now to Luke chapter 24. You know that Jesus is about to ascend back to the Father in heaven. These are among the last words that He will speak to his apostles. And verse 46, thus it is written, said Jesus, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. And you are witnesses of these things. Now, one other passage. Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. As the Holy Spirit comes upon the apostles after Jesus had ascended back to heaven, we are given this record of what the Lord had said to them, to the apostles. You shall receive power, verse 8 of Acts 1, when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem and in all Judea and in Samaria and to the end of the earth. The Lord was going to show forth the fact that when he chose Jerusalem as his city, it was not as the capital of an earthly kingdom that it was to get its glory from. It was rather because it was from Jerusalem that the good news, the message of salvation in Jesus Christ, would begin to be proclaimed on the day of Pentecost. And the people of God would lead many thousands to Christ in the city of Jerusalem and in the surrounding area, Judea. And then they would go up into Samaria, which was Jews, many of whom had married Gentiles, had Gentiles in their family. They're still Jews. And the gospel is preached to the Samaritans. Isn't that what Philip was doing in Acts 8 when many of the Samaritans, hearing him preach Christ, were baptized? And then the Lord says, go out on the road leading to Gaza and meet an Ethiopian treasurer out there. And he met him and taught him and baptized him. These were all people who were followers of the law of Moses. And out of the east, John is over here on Patmos, and the Lord is saying to him, I am going to give a period of relative calm, and during that time, the message will begin at Jerusalem. It will spread until it reaches the whole earth. And it was God's plan that it be that way. I'm not guessing. You know I'm not. Because doesn't Romans 1:16 say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile. It pleased God to do it that way. He wanted to be shown that it was not the nation of Israel on earth, but spiritual Israel, the church, that was in his mind all along. And that earthly nation was just a means by which he was bringing this about. The nation that was founded by Abraham, is that what God's plan called for? No, it was a means for God's plan to be accomplished through the seed that would be born, who would die upon the cross and be a blessing to all the nations of the world. I think when in chapter 7 of Revelation, when John said this angel was ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, he cried with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. All right. Boy, people can get into wild speculation. Does the earth have four corners? Well, I'll put it this way. Some of you may still believe the earth is square and round, flying flat and all that. But does anybody in here really have a problem with the idea of the term four corners of the earth being a figurative term? Yeah, the four directions. But would we all agree that's a figurative term? Anybody have a problem with it? Then why, if we can understand the four corners of the earth is figurative and we don't have a problem with that, why do people make such an issue out of this mark on the forehead? Well, that's literal now. That's literal. No, it isn't. It's figurative. Sealed in the forehead. Now, even I can figure out what's behind the forehead. Isn't he simply saying until all those who will be converted are converted? Sealed, that just means have made their decision to follow Christ and have fully committed their lives to him in their minds, because that's where decisions come from. That's where commitment comes from. Not from the emotions, but from the mind. A knowledge of his will and a desire and a determination to do what he wants us to do. So, he is saying then, don't harm the earth. Don't let the empire fall. Keep the empire there as a stabilizing force to give the church a chance to spread from Jerusalem through Judea and Samaria and throughout the Jewish enclaves, throughout all the provinces, and then turn to the Gentiles and bring many Gentiles to Christ. And I want you to notice two other things. Here's one. You'll notice that he says, and I heard the number of those who were sealed. 144,000. Of all the tribes, how does he put it, of the children of Israel were sealed. Where'd that number come from? Well, let's see. There's 12 tribes that he lists, right? 12,000 from each tribe. 12 times 12,000 is 144,000. Is he saying that literally 12,000 people from each tribe of Israel would be converted to Christ? Why would anybody want to think that? It's a figurative number. And what he's saying is that during that time, it was God's promise that the Jews would first be given the opportunity to hear the gospel. And during that time, he was giving them that opportunity so that all who would be converted would be converted. All that were willing would have the opportunity. Was it literally 144,000? No. No. Might not have been that many. Might have been 3 times that many. Nobody knows. The point is, we ought not to get into that literal trap, because then, boy, you got a problem. Only 12,000 from each tribe. What if there aren't 12,000 that are converted? Or what if there's 12,000 and one more wants to do it? Nope, sorry. You're shut out. It's a figurative term. Now, that's one thing. A fellow said, right here in this building, 2 weeks ago, we were talking about it. I overheard it. Now, he didn't say it to me. He said, one of the reasons that I've never obeyed the gospel, this was a man that he does not hear very often, is because I've read that about 144,000, and I don't figure I'm of that number. Yes, sir. He quit reading too soon. In the first place, if it was literal, it referred to the Jews, not to the Gentiles. And it's not literal. And furthermore, it does not refer to all the Jews who would ever be converted, but only to those who would be converted during that time. As a matter of fact, I wrote down several points. Number one, this word Israel, Prince of God, that's a term that was used to describe the descendants of Jacob. But the word Jew, where'd that word come from? That's right. It originally meant one of the tribe of Judah, right? By the time John wrote, it referred to any Israelite. So you see, even then the word Jew is used figuratively to represent more. All right, now here's another thing to keep in mind. This number means all of those who would be saved from among the Jews, the Israelites, by obedience to the gospel during the time between the 6th and the 7th seals. And it's a figurative number, a definite number standing for an indefinite number. And then you ought to know that there is no reference to Gentiles in that verse. None. But if you go on down to verse 9, he says, after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues. Would this be after? Isn't that what he said? Now, I'm slow, but I got to ask you a question. Does the word all mean all or nearly all? Were the Israelites a nation? I mean, were they in... Did the Lord refer to them as a nation, a people? And doesn't he say that after the 144,000, that sometime after that, then there would be an uncountable number of all nations, and folks, that would include Jews. As well as those are not Jews, but it's all nations, you see. So he's talking about those Jews who were converted during a specific period. And even then, it's to be taken figuratively. And it doesn't place any limit on the number of Jews who ultimately would obey the gospel. Now I want you to notice something else. If you look at verse 9, after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice. All right, now think about this for a second. When a while ago we were reading from Isaiah 62, let me see if I can relate this to you, and you see if this is what he was saying. Isaiah said, sometimes I want to give up on Israel. Sometimes I'm so frustrated I just want to stop, but I can't do it because the Lord has intended that Zion, Jerusalem, remain the center of his revelation until such time as people all over the world recognize that out of Jerusalem came this brightness of God, this glory of God. And when this brightness of God has been finally seen and acknowledged by the Gentiles, then he said, the people of God will receive a new name. Won't be Zion, won't be Jerusalem, won't be Israel, won't be Jew, won't be Hebrew, won't be Semite. A new name. Whose name? Well, it will be one that the mouth of the Lord would name. And it would come only when the Gentiles had been fully accepted into the people of God by means of that gospel which first began to be preached in Jerusalem. In Acts 10, Simon Peter is called to go down to the house of Cornelius. Isn't that right? Cornelius was a Gentile. True, isn't it? He was an uncircumcised man. Is that right? Peter goes to the house after being persuaded pretty forcefully. And when he gets there, he realizes that Cornelius and everybody in the house is a Gentile, and that he as a Jew is not even by tradition supposed to be in the same building with them. But he says, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, and he wants me to be here. And so he preaches the gospel to them, and when they are shown by the Lord's action himself to be proper candidates for the gospel, Peter could not withhold water, and he baptized them for the remission of sins, just like had been done on the day of Pentecost. Well, that opened the doors. And you remember that it wasn't long after that that Barnabas goes up to Antioch of Syria. The Jerusalem congregation sent him up there because the Gentiles had been responding to the gospel. And the Jerusalem brethren were very concerned. They were afraid paganism would be coming in. They were afraid these people weren't really converted. And so they sent Barnabas up there to see him. When Barnabas got up there, he saw that truly these people are being converted to Christ. These Gentiles are faithful, dedicated Christians, children of God. And so he sent over to Tarsus, where Saul, now the Apostle Paul, was staying, and said, I want you to come back over here to Antioch with me and work with me because these people have received the forgiveness of God. And so Barnabas gets Saul, and they go and they continue there a whole year with the church, and many people are added to the Lord. And listen to this. Acts 11, verse 26 says, and the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. There you have it. There's the name, the mouth of the Lord name. And I'm going to give you one more passage. The Apostle Peter, same man that baptized Cornelius, the Apostle Peter, later wrote in 1 Peter chapter 4, he said, there can be shame in suffering if you suffer for evil doing. But he said, if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this name. So you see, all of this is a part of what God had promised and planned and carried out. All right, our time's up.